My lords, distinguished councillors, ladies, gentlemen, and rebellious colonials. 2 words for the lot of you: we're back. Now, it's a great pleasure to be here again today. My topic is free market economics. And we're going to do economics in practice. Now, what is economics, anyone? Sir, yes.
Sir,
I'm looking at you.
I just doesn't have something to do with currency?
Yes, almost right. Anyone do better? Yes.
The study of money and how money works?
That's getting there, and at the back there?
Currency system?
Not quite. It's not just to do with currency. Economics is the science of wealth. It's the science of how to get rich, how to stay rich, and how to make everybody else around you rich. That's what it's about. How many economists do you know who are rich? Not many. So they're not very good at what they do. Now, the other part of my talk is about the free market. What is the free market? Anyone? Mr. Constitution, yes.
Free market is a concept in which you are free to buy and sell anything that you want.
Exactly, that's very good. And you got the key word in, you are free to buy and sell. You can sell your skills, you can sell your brain, or you can make things and sell them. How many of you have already formed your own corporation? Hands up. Right, some of the councillors have, and another councillor. Are there any pupils here, the students here? You have formed your own corporation. Come up here, please, ma'am. I'd like to congratulate you very much indeed, because you have started your own corporation. That is what everyone in a free market system is free to do, and you have already done it. What I'd like you to do is to tell me and tell the class in a good loud voice what you did. What does your corporation do, and how did you set it up?
I set one up. I got a lot of older folks in my town, and I go around, I help them with what they need help with, and I mow lawns, I do gardening and stuff, and then I have other jobs, but I do that at home.
And how old are you now?
14.
14. So here is somebody, I'm going to make a prediction now, who is going to end up as a billionaire. Because she has done what you should all do. Started her own corporation, and what she sells is her own devotion to old people. She goes round and helps them with their gardening, whatever else they want to do, and they pay her to do so. And so you keep accounts, so you know how much profit you make each year.
They kind of do offers and I take it. Well, I have set stuff for other stuff,
But you take what you can get. Now, that is all part of the free market. Of course, what you would like to do is to charge $1 million to each client, but they're not necessarily willing to pay it. So you take what you can get. That is a very sensible starting approach. Do you yet employ anybody else to help you?
I've applied my cousin, some kids from town.
Wonderful. So here is a business that is already, and this is a businesswoman at the age of 14 who is already, albeit probably on a part-time basis, employing some of her fellow citizens to work in her corporation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest that the appropriate reaction to that is to give her a thunderous round of applause. Thank you very much. Do go back to your seat. God bless you. Well done. And incidentally, Emma has the strongest handshake of any woman I have ever met. So if you shake hands with her on a business deal, you want to make sure you've still got your hands afterwards. But the great thing about the free market is that everyone may succeed in our society who defers to the principle of our society, which is to aspire and to excel. All you have to do is dream your dream and then turn it into reality, and turn it into reality really well, as Emma has done. And that quotation, incidentally, about aspiring and excelling, comes from Benjamin Disraeli, who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom 100 years ago. So all of you should, in the next year, start your own corporations. You can ask Emma how. It's not very difficult. You have to fill in a few forms. Probably if you're under 16, you may need to get a parent or guardian to sign them with you. And then you simply apply to get a corporation off the shelf. You then need to appoint at least one director and at least one chief finance officer, and you are in business. And once you are in business, you can do a number of things which they can't do in countries where they do not have a free market. Among other things, you can raise capital. And there are two traditional ways of raising capital. And then capital is the amount of cash you need to get the business off the ground and make it really motor along. And there are two main sources of capital. One is you can borrow the capital from the bank. And they will tell you at what rate of interest you will be able to borrow. In other words, you have to pay them a certain percentage of what you have borrowed every year, as well as paying back a certain percentage of what you've borrowed, so that the bank makes a bit of money out of you. That's how banks make their money. They try to look for the good prospects, the companies like this one that are going to be a success, and they will lend money to those companies to expand their operations. So that's one source of finance. And the other source of finance is shares, where you can go around your mates, or you can go to the stock market if you're big enough, and you can sell shares in your company. And the great advantage about shares is that the liability to pay them back does not exist. It's completely free money. Of course, you have to be honest and do a good job for them, and you pay them what's called a dividend each year in respect of their shares, and they can sell their shares to other people on the open market. And so the two ways of raising money for a business are: one, borrow it from the bank and pay interest; the other, borrow it from your mates, or not borrow it, but actually get it from your mates free and for nothing. And then if your business does well, you pay them dividends each year, which is a certain percentage, depending on how many shares they bought. That's how much money they get, and they can make a lot of money out of that if they start in. If you were all to buy shares in Emma's business now, you will be worth a lot of money in 10 years' time, I'd be prepared to bet. So if anyone wants to buy shares from Emma, there she is, see her afterwards. Now, these basic elements of how a free market works evolved over the centuries, first in Venice, La Serenissima, the Republic of Venice, just off the coast of Italy. And they had an elaborate system of banking and corporations, which then eventually spread around the world. Then throughout Europe, notably in Hamburg, there was a Bank of Hamburg which issued its own currency. So those of you who are talking about currencies as being part of economics, they are indeed part of economics, but only a part. And the currency in Hamburg was known as the Mark Banco. And the Mark Banco was not a physical entity, it was the equivalent of a certain fixed amount of silver. And the Bank of Hamburg, for 250 years, ran a completely honest book. Every piece of paper it issued saying this piece of paper is worth 100 marks Banco had to have 100 marks Banco worth of silver in the vaults of the bank. So what brought this extraordinary unit of currency which was used right across Europe, from Hamburg all the way down to Venice, though not in England, we had our own pound. Why was this so successful? It was successful because it was honest money. And it was the last time that any bank issued honest money, by which I mean every piece of paper they issued saying, I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of $1, there was actually $1's worth of real silver or gold in the vaults of the bank. So that was a completely honest bank. How do we know? Because this wonderful experiment in honest money, which enabled Europe to grow in prosperity enormously for 250 years until about 1800, was brought to an end by whom? Napoleon. Yes, Napoleon invaded Hamburg and tried to help himself to the silver in the vaults. And when he got there, he decided to put his accountants in to see whether the silver in the vaults was equal to the what their ledgers showed they'd hand out in pieces of paper to represent that silver in the vaults. And they found that there was 3% more silver in the vaults than the value of all the pieces of paper which had the authority of the Bank of Hamburg on them that had been handed out all over Europe for 250 years. That was how honest and how competent the Bank of Hamburg was. Now, you now look at the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve is known as the Federal Reserve joke. Because although it's supposed to be a bank, it was founded by bankers for bankers so that they could get rich and make you poor rather than providing an honest service. Does anybody know what is the value of $1 today in the currency of 1913, which was the year when the Federal Reserve... Yes, sir?
About 12 cents.
It's about 1 cent. 1 cent in those days would buy you what $1 buys today. 99% of the value of every dollar entrusted to the Federal Reserve Bank has gone missing into the pockets of absolute bankers. That's where it's gone. So your currency, like the British currency and like most currencies around the world, is called a fiat currency. That means the government declares that it has a certain value, but there is in fact no, or insufficient, and in the Federal Reserve's case, very insufficient, money actually held in the shape of gold and silver in the vaults of the bank to represent the notes that have been printed and handed out. And so what you get if you don't have honest money is inflation. And that means that your dollar buys less and less each year. And that makes it very difficult for people like Emma to do her business, because it means instead of fixing her prices and leaving them there for 200 years at a time, as was possible throughout Central Europe thanks to the Bank of Hamburg running honest money, she'll have to change her prices every year or two to keep pace with the decline in the value of the dollar. She'll have to keep putting her prices up, and her customers won't like that. So inflation, which is the fruit of dishonest money, of insufficient reserves in the vaults of the bank to match the notes in issue, that makes it very difficult for businesses to function correctly and to function efficiently. So the elements then of a free market that is properly run are, first of all, sound money run either by a national central bank or by competing private banks offering their own currencies. And in Scotland, for instance, until about 200 years ago, each of the Scottish banks issued their own currencies, and they were required by law to have enough gold and silver in the vaults to match the amount of currency that was in issue. So it was properly run. Then they made the mistake of allowing the Bank of England to take things over, and although they can still issue currency notes, they can only do so with the permission of the Bank of England, and the Bank of England is every bit as fraudulent as the Federal Reserve Bank. So we have funny money just as you do, and this is bad news. But the other element in a free market is the people who are willing to make and sell things, and they form corporations to do that, and corporations have certain privileges which individuals in business do not have, which is why I say it's well worth your while to start your own corporation straight away. And if you start your own corporation, one thing is that you have limited liability. If your corporation goes horribly bust, as long as it goes honestly bust and you have not committed any kind of dishonesty or fraud, your liability is limited to the shares that you have issued to third parties, and they have paid for those shares, and if those shares become worthless, that is their problem and not yours. So why in a capitalist system, in a free market system, do companies enjoy this privilege? Corporations, why do they enjoy this privilege? The reason is to encourage all of you to do what Emma has done. Because the vast majority of the wealth that is created in the United States is not created by the vast corporations that employ tens or hundreds of thousands of people. It's the little companies like Emma's company. That is what America's prosperity is founded upon. So she is a shining example of how all of you can participate in creating wealth, not only for yourselves, but also for those around you. So this is something you should all realize is a rare and precious freedom of which most of you have not yet taken advantage. So I'm going to suggest to you that after this meeting, you should ask your parents whether they will assist you in establishing your own corporation. And you can make it a corporation that, in Emma's case, she sells her skills as a gardener. James Morrison here, when he came over to the States, he fell in love with an American lass, and having seen the American lasses that I've met over here, I can quite understand why he did that. And he then said, right, what am I going to do? So he has set up his own business, and he's doing handyman stuff, rather like Emma, but on a slightly larger scale. And he's doing so well that the embarrassingly large truck that you see parked out there is his truck, which he has managed to earn the money for in the few months that he's had this business going. So you can see how very profitable businesses, even doing the most straightforward things like handyman work and painting and garden clearance, just how profitable it can be. And all of you, if you're strong and fit, can do things like that, and you should. And you should start as soon as you like, because then you'll start earning your own money, paying your own way, buying your own fancy auto. In no time at all, he'll be driving around in a swank Ferrari. I can see it happen. Emma is a little bit too young to drive anything at the moment, but by the time she gets to be old enough to drive something, that too will be a Ferrari. Now, how many of you here would not like to own a Ferrari? There you are. Oh, there's one. Well, what would you like, sir? You wouldn't like a Ferrari, but you don't know what you would like. Right. That kind of indecision does not get you very far in business. No, sir, you were also a dissenter, I think.
I'm old stock in Ferrari, so I'm laying with people back and they make their money for me and I'll be.
Now, there's an important thing. You see, you can buy shares in other people's business. And Dr. Long here, who is a surprisingly shrewd cookie, has bought shares in the Ferrari business. And if Ferrari does well, they pay a dividend each year, so much per share. And by now, he will have had far more money in dividends from Ferrari than ever he paid for the shares originally. Is that right? Exactly. Because all of you will soon be contributing to his wealth by buying Ferraris once you've set up your own companies. And it is very important that you understand how crucial this freedom is. Because in most countries of the world, it does not exist to the same degree that it exists in the United States of America. Because one of the things that your founding fathers wanted, and we always tie everything at this camp back to your Constitution, is they wanted you to be able to have not only life, not only liberty, but also the pursuit of happiness. And so if you make products that other people want to buy, it might be your services, or it might be goods as well, and other people want to buy those, then you are going to get rich by selling them to them. They are going to be happier because they're able to buy things that you have created and which they want. I'll give you an example of some of the things that I have done in my business career. My main business was a consultancy. I advised other corporations on how to make more money and how to deal with troublesome bureaucrats trying to stop them do business. And if you employed me, you found that your company not only made much more money than if you didn't, but also that the bureaucrats who are endlessly trying to say you can't do this and you can't do that were kept at bay so that the company could get on with doing its business. So that was my main trade. But I also did other things. There are so many things you can do, so many freedoms when you start your own corporation. For instance, my corporation invented 2 mathematical puzzles, and these were called the eternity puzzles. And the puzzles had 200 pieces and 250 pieces respectively, and no picture. And you had to try to fit these mathematically shaped pieces together into a great big frame so that there were no gaps and no overlaps, just like a real jigsaw. And the first person to solve that puzzle would get 1 million sterling, which is about $1.5 to $2 million. So I was putting my fortune very much on the line by offering this for sale. Now, would anyone like to tell me, how did I make sure that the risk of not having to pay out too quickly because somebody solved it straight away would not bankrupt me? What did I do? And I'm going to ask for anybody else other than Mr. Constitution, because he knows the answers to everything. He is Mr. Knowledge. Sir, over there. No, well, it's good thinking, but no, it wouldn't have been. I think no shareholder would have taken that risk. After all, I have no piece of paper to say I'm a mathematician. So shareholders would say, nope, not a good bet. Yes? I didn't hear that.
You said you just made a really hard.
I did indeed make a really hard puzzle, but yes, sir.
Pre-orders?
Pre-orders? No. No, you're nearly right. We did actually get a lot of pre-orders. We sold a shed load of them before it was even officially launched. Anybody else? Right. One of the things you can do to minimize any risk to your business is to insure against the risk. It's really simple. So it's quite a funny story this, you'll enjoy it. I went to Lloyd's of London and I took a beautifully made walnut model of this puzzle, because I had a resident cabinet maker. In fact, I had 2 resident cabinet makers at that time, so one of them made this beautiful puzzle, and I took it down, fully assembled, to Lloyd's of London, to one of the insurance brokers, who is the guy who puts you in touch with the underwriter, who ultimately takes the risk, and the broker just introduces you to the underwriter. That's how it works. So I went into the broker and I said, here is this puzzle. This is not actually the real puzzle, it's like it, because I don't want you to see the real one. Otherwise you could help yourself to the £1 million prize, and that wouldn't be any good for the underwriters. So I showed him the puzzle. I said, I want to insure this for 1 million sterling against anyone solving this before I have made enough money from sales of the puzzle to pay the prize when somebody eventually solves it. So he said, I see these are mathematically shaped pieces. And I said, yes. He said, well, do you see that rectangular object just behind you? Shut it on your way out. So I said, look, I've traveled all the way down from Scotland to see you, and you said you'd give me 20 minutes of your time. I would like to take that 20 minutes, and what I've done is I've got a little challenge for you, because all these brokers and underwriters, they're basically kind of gamblers. Only it's a beneficial kind of gambling. And so if you offer them a proposition, they will always go for it. So I said, look, I've got a 12-piece sample puzzle here, and all you have to do is put these 12 pieces into this simple frame so that they fit with no gaps or overlaps, just like a jigsaw puzzle. And if you can do that in 20 minutes, which is the length of my presentation, you give this to your assistant, you let him try and do it while I'm talking to you, and if in 20 minutes he can solve it, I will accept that maybe this isn't all as hard as I think it is. And so he said, yes, I'm going for that. He said, I can't resist that. And I knew he wouldn't be able to resist that. So I pushed the board and the pieces over to his assistant, who immediately started trying to slap them in there and get them all to fit. And there always was one or two that wouldn't fit, and he would try and rearrange them, and it still wouldn't fit, and he was getting frantic. Meanwhile, I was presenting to the broker why it was so difficult to do this puzzle. I said, if your colleague here cannot solve a 12-piece puzzle in 20 minutes, you may like to know that each additional piece that we add to puzzles of this kind multiplies the difficulty of solving this puzzle by 3. And there are 209 pieces. So the difficulty of solving this puzzle is about 200 to the 3 to the power of 200 times harder than this puzzle, this little one that you've got here. So I then produced a sheet of paper full of numbers on it. And there was just rows and rows of digits. And I handed that across. And I said, this is the number of possible ways of arranging the pieces of this big puzzle to fit into that frame, except that only a tiny, tiny fraction of this huge number are solutions. That's why it's so hard. And he looked at this sheet of numbers. He said, what program did you use to produce this calculation? I said, there is no program available on the market that will produce a number that large. Normally a computer will only print out numbers about 32 digits long if you're lucky. I said, I had to write a program that would print out a number this large, having calculated it first. He said, oh, so you kind of know what you're doing then? I said, yes, I do. 20 minutes went by, and then his assistant pushed it back to me and he gave up. He said, I can't solve this. So I said to the broker, I said, there you are. He couldn't solve it. We have a deal, I think. Not so fast, he said. What did he think I'd done? Why was he suspicious? Because they have to be suspicious. No, not Mr. Constitution just yet. Anybody else? Over at the back there, sir. Yes.
False puzzle?
It was a false puzzle. There was no solution. That's what he thought. So, and that's what he said. You were quite right. You see, you'd make a very good insurance broker. So he passed the pieces back to me and the frame, and I went bang, 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 put them all in, pushed them back to the guy who'd been trying to solve it. I said, are these the same pieces, or have I palmed any? He said, no, they are the same pieces. It's the same frame, and the pieces do fit. Now, whenever you want to close a deal, you have to hit them not once, but twice in succession. Because there is a psychological technique known as post-operative suggestion. If you knock them the first time, they can recoil from that. Knock them the second time very quickly, and they will fall over. And it actually works physically as well as theoretically. I'm going to demonstrate this. James, stand up. Stand with your back to the chair. Mm-hmm. Now, you see, if I hit him like that, not very hard, he can resist that. But if I hit him like that, no harder, he falls down, and he's completely astonished, aren't you? That is post-operative suggestion. And it works just the same when you're negotiating a business deal as it does when you are physically exposed to it. So what I did, having showed them that the puzzle they thought there was no solution to, because it was only a 12-piece puzzle and they couldn't solve it in 20 minutes, so it must be a fake puzzle. But it wasn't. So that was blow number one. Then I said, very casually, you always deliver the second blow casually. I said, in fact, there are 2,339 distinct ways, not counting rotations and reflections, of putting these 12 pieces into that frame. And your assistant could not find even one of them in 20 minutes. Do we have a deal? Yes, he said. And so Lloyd underwrote the risk. And that's how I knew that even if somebody solved it too quickly, I wouldn't have to pay out my fortune, because Lloyd's would pay. And you may want to know whether anybody solved it. They did. But it took them 18 months. It was actually solved by a guy at Government Communications Headquarters. The code crackers there were no longer cracking codes for Her Majesty's government. They were using their vast supercomputer to solve our puzzle. So I had to pay out the £1 million, but did I mind? Well, no, because by that time I had sold 500,000 puzzles at $100 each. So there was plenty of money for me, plenty of money for the manufacturers, plenty of money for the retailers, plenty of money for the insurers. They all took their cut, and I became a rich man overnight. So that is how anyone, and I'm not even a mathematician, can invent something out of nothing, turn it into a business and make it, but you have to sell it. Nothing happens until something is sold. So then, a few years later, we did another one. And this time I recruited the people from GCHQ who had solved the previous one to make the next one more difficult. And we sold another 500,000 of them, and this time I split the profits between us, the insurers, and them. But nobody solved that one, so we didn't have to find a couple of $1 million to pay out the prize. So that is just one example of how you can do business and make a profit just by using this as well as by using that. So use your mind, use your body, use whichever works best for you. And you can create a business out of nothing, as so many people have done, and end up comfortably rich. But then there is an obstacle in the shape of those who do not believe that a free market should exist. And those are, what do we call them politically, anybody? Communists, yes. Communists and socialists. They are all about the redistribution of wealth, and they're not really concerned with the creation of wealth. Yes?
So what countries are against free market?
Right, China, for one. They now have what looks like a free market, but it's actually very heavily regulated by the state, which controls every aspect of every business. It's very, very centralized. Russia has adopted a kind of cowboy capitalism where the state, in the shape of Mr. Putin, is robbing the people. So communist countries will almost always not be running a proper free market system. But also, increasingly, the socialist countries of, say, Western Europe are falling out of love with what they now call capitalism, which we call the free market. Capitalism was Marx's term for the free market. So whenever you hear somebody saying they don't like capitalism, what they're really saying is, I'm a communist, but I'm not going to use that word of myself because I know how many people communism killed. Does anybody know how many people communism killed in the 20th century and the first part of the 21st? Rough estimate? How many?
500 million.
500 million is not a bad estimate, yes? 100 million, it's somewhere between those two. Nobody actually knows. Yes, sir? What? No, it's a lot more than that. China alone accounts for at least 65 million. Yes? 90 million, that's one of the estimates I've seen, quite right. So it's around the 100 to 200 million mark probably, but nobody knows. It could be an awful lot more. But it's the most murderous system of politics ever devised. And the so-called Democrat Party here in the United States, is there anyone who supports the Democrat Party in here? I didn't think there would be, but if you do support the present Democrat Party, you're actually supporting something which in most vital respects is indistinguishable from the communism that killed all those people. You really don't want to go there. And one of the things that the communist countries were always trying to do when I was working in 10 Downing Street was they would try to interfere with the working of the free market so as to destroy the economy of countries like Britain. And they always used to attack the energy sector because every business depends on being able to turn on the lights, run the machinery, etc., deliver the goods. All of that takes energy. So they would attack the energy sector. So I'm going to end with a spy story. I worked in 10 Downing Street as an advisor to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. But that was not all that I did. I was also there to make sure that a strike, which we knew was coming at the time when I was appointed, by the National Union of Mine Workers, which would have brought Britain completely to a standstill, would fail once they started it. Now, we knew that the miners themselves were the most loyal people in Britain. They were devoted to their country, devoted to their fellow man, and they were digging the darkness underground to bring men light. It's the most dangerous job on the planet, and bravely they did it. So these were my heroes, but their leaders were communists trained and paid for by Moscow. And you're going to say, oh, this is just all Reds in the bed talk. No, it isn't. Because Arthur Scargill, whom I knew, he was the president of the National Union of Mine Workers. He was from Yorkshire, which is where I did my initial journalistic training. I used to go drinking with him in the pubs there, so I knew who he was. And on the 28th of July, 1979, 3 months after Margaret Thatcher had first been elected Prime Minister, he sailed on a Polish freighter from the port of Tilbury, not far outside London, to what was then Leningrad. Anyone know what Leningrad is now called? St. Petersburg, quite right. And there he took a sealed train, as Lenin had before him, went to Moscow, was met there, and he was taken to the Patrice Lumumba University of Terrorism, which is where all the terrorist grunts all around the world were trained. After 3 weeks there, they realized he was a cut above the rest. They transferred him to the Lenin Institute, where the leading terrorists of the world were trained. And he spent 5 months there. Then he got an Aeroflot, Russian Airlines flight back to Paris, and then changed to a British Airways flight so that he would be seen landing from Paris on a British flight rather than from Moscow on a Russian one. And we were following him all the way there at both of those institutes and all the way back. So when the strike eventually began, at that stage I was in 10 Downing Street working to try to make sure that we managed the strike effectively. We knew what he had done. The question was, how were we going to let the miners know? And we had to decide whether we revealed this story I've just told you about his being trained in Moscow at all. Because it takes 150 agents to monitor somebody traveling around like that. That's how many were monitoring him, so that I can tell you these facts today. And we knew that if we made this story public, the Russians would see that we knew, and all those agents would have been identified, rounded up and killed. So we had to decide whether to let 150 agents go so that they could no longer ever again work for the intelligence services and get the story out, or keep it to ourselves. It was decided that so crucial was it that the miners themselves should know what he'd done, that it was decided that we would tell them, and I was deputed to find the best way of doing that. So I got on my motorbike and I went up to a country house somewhere in England, which was owned by a friend of the Prime Minister, and I said, whatever you're doing, stop it. He was actually mowing his front lawn with a huge tractor. I said, get off that, get in that new Merc of yours. I want you to take these cuttings from the Times, where this story is told, to every pit in Britain, and you are to talk to every miner you can. You are to give them copies of these cuttings. And he said, why didn't you put this story in the Daily Mirror, which the miners read anyway? I said, because if I put it in the Daily Mirror, which is a piece of junk, they wouldn't believe it. But if it's in the Times, they don't read it, but they'll believe it. And so if you make sure they get the cutting from the Times, they'll read it as well. So that's what your job is. So he changed his clothes, got into his car, took the cuttings, and drove 29,000 miles that year, visiting every pit in Britain, talking to every miner he could. He then funded and founded the National Working Miners Committee that broke the strike, and eventually the strike was broken, the miners were defeated, and their leadership was then isolated by the membership. They had no further real role in the union anymore. And we managed to save British democracy from this attempt by a foreign power to interfere with it in the most basic way by attacking our energy supplies. And we were also able to trace 20 million sterling that had been paid by the Russians to the Miners' Union via the then Czechoslovak embassy, which was in the communist bloc. But again, we were following all the transactions. They didn't know we could, but we could. So only now can I tell this story. But that was how we made the strike come to an end. And there were some very funny moments. There was one really fascinating moment because we had set up a separate war room in a suite at Claridge's, which was permanently kept by my friend. He was a very rich man. And so there, he effectively ran the campaign against the strike because the minister in charge of the Department of Trade and Industry, whose job it really was, could not be trusted to do it right. because he wanted to remove Margaret Thatcher and replace her as Prime Minister. So we had to cut him out of the loop. And he eventually found out. So he rang my friend at Claridge's and said to him, look, I'm the Minister for Trade and Industry. You can't be running this strike from Claridge's. And so my friend said, oh, you'll probably be wanting to speak to the head of the National Coal Board. He's with me now. And he handed him over to the head of the Coal Board. And then the minister realized that he was not having any role in solving this strike. We had done that. So you can see that in order to defend the right of people like Emma and James to run their businesses freely and not to have communists interfering with the creation of wealth, as they are always trying to do, this nation, just like ours, has to be prepared to defend itself vigorously and efficiently against them. And the front line of defense in that particular battle is the intelligence services. So when you pay your taxes, you will know that at least some of them are being well spent on protecting the right of members of your nation to run their corporations free from attack by those who would destroy them, and in destroying them, destroy this great nation to which, for me, it's always such a pleasure to visit. God bless you all, and God bless America. Thank you very much.